Populism is not the cause of our problems. It is the consequence of a system that has stopped delivering for large segments of the population. Rajan.
Welcome to Analyzing Finance with Nick. In today's video, we are going to be discussing the class war in the form of political populism. And really just, to be clear, a simple definition of political populism. In the simplest definition, populism is politicians who run to act on the will of the people. But where it gets kind of muddy is really what is the will of the people. And populist rhetoric often has some common themes that are not just really what the current political winds are one way or the other. A few kind of common components is just a general anti-elitism, really bias against the business leaders, politicians, and establishment political parties, establishment cultural and economic institutions, and just the idea of the fact that there is a hierarchy and that the leading classes are either mismanaging it or are maliciously negligent, like they are deliberately trying to enslave the lower classes or steal from them in some way, shape, or form. There's generally a moral binary, like the righteous people, and the righteous people usually generally refers to the lower classes or the outsiders, those who are not really connected to the current political system, versus the immoral elites. Yeah, they claim to represent the people, and that anybody who opposes them is a traitor. And it kind of has a very hostile view towards checks and balances. Populism usually is authoritarian in nature, and it's not necessarily left-wing or right-wing. There are left-wing and right-wing forms of populism. Left-wing populism is usually socialistic or very pro-labor. Historical examples of left-wing populism is like Fidel Castro, Hugo Chavez. It's very common in Latin America. Bernie Sanders is probably the equivalent of one in the United States, or Eugene Debs, or even Franklin Delano Roosevelt, I would consider a left-leaning populist, and that's why he has the class traitor moniker. Right-wing populists are people who appeal to nationalism or nativist sentiments. They're generally anti-immigration, they're generally anti-trade, but I think the anti-immigration and anti-trade thing can be common for both left and right-wing populism. And right-wing populists tend to often have theocratic views occasionally, but that's not really always the case. And the other common thing is that they both try to rebel against economic orthodoxy, because to them, economic orthodoxy is the system that rewards the elites at their expense, whether that's their views on globalization and trade, whether it's their views on the way tax policy should be structured, whether it's their views on the welfare state, whether it's too large or too small. Whatever the establishment views in economics, it's usually branded as a tool of oppression. Like example of probably more right-wing populists would be Donald Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil, the Le Pen family in France. And if you want more older historical examples, you can use Mussolini in Italy, but he is more of a fascist, but he did have some right-wing populism. And on top of that, you would have right-wing populism really hasn't emerged that strongly in American politics. Usually the right has been more associated with the business elites. And so that's why most of the examples I have are foreign. And most of the populists are historically aligned with the left, whereas what's happened really with Trump is that it's the first time where really right-wing populism has gained meaningful traction in the United States. Other examples of centrist but still authoritarian populists would be people like Huey Long, Andrew Yang, Ross Perot. So it's not entirely a right or left, but it's generally somebody who wants to just kind of take down the existing system and try to use ideas that generally sound really good on paper, but work badly in practice. Like example would be economic protectionism. It's the most notable example of populism. It's kind of common through all strains. And usually, why does populism emerge? Populism emerging is a product of usually two things. One is that the political establishment is not addressing a structural issue. And really for right-wing populism in the US and Europe, it's really been simply the establishment either ignoring or acting against the will of the people on immigration, particularly illegal immigration. President Trump was able to win the primary in 2016, not because he ascribed to Republican orthodoxy and had the biggest support from the donor elite class, or really anything traditionally a right-wing politician would have to win. He won really simply on his hostility to immigration. People will say it's other things like his personality and his ability to drum up class resentment, but ultimately, out of 16 candidates in that primary, he was the only one who took a strong opposition to immigration and was willing to propose a restrictionist policy in a believable way. None of the other candidates did that. And that's the same thing in Europe. If a lot of these right-wing populist movements, which actually on their economic policies are pretty center, and including President Trump too, to a certain degree, he's pretty center on a lot of things in economics. Like he's not willing to actually reform or cut any entitlements, for example. And he's trying to discredit the independence of the central bank, which go against a lot of right-wing and libertarian orthodoxy when it comes to economics. If the establishment on either side of the aisle, or in a nonpartisan way, addressed immigration from a moderately restrictionist perspective, that would take a lot of the populist heat off of them and at least slow down the process of populism. But I don't think that alone would ultimately stop the populist movement, because that's only one leg in this movement. The other leg in why populism has become increasingly popular since 2001 has simply been declining economic prosperity. And declining economic prosperity, especially for those who are under the professional classes in our American class hierarchy chart. So the working class and the dependent class. So those with a single source of income, whether it's from a private employer, the government as an employer, or the state. And these people have been the net losers of globalization. They've been the net losers of open borders immigration. They've been the net losers of the winner-take-all economy structured by the internet. And as a result, they are angry, and they are a larger chunk of the electorate than the professional classes and above who run the institutions of society. And that is why you see political populism rising, because the standard of living for these people has continued to decline. Like nominal GDP and even real GDP, if you include government spending deficits into that. So if you don't subtract out the government spending above its tax revenue from GDP, we've had positive growth basically almost the entire time since 2001, except for the 2008-2009 GFC and the first 2 quarters of 2022. But that number go up in that sense doesn't mean anything to these people, because their standard of living are going down. You could see that with a lot of these memes of people who used to be able to afford to buy 3-bedroom houses now have to live in studio apartments. People who originally could afford to send their kids to college without debt now can't even pay off their own student debt. And so you're having these strains of populism coming from a rising working class on one hand and a rising precariat class on the other hand. The precariats have become the torchbearer of left-wing populism, which I discussed in a video I did several months ago about genteel poverty and the precariat class, whereas the working class has become the quintessential symbol of right-wing populism. And it's similar trends in other countries, but for this analysis, I'm going to be primarily focusing on the United States. And a lot of people in the establishment and the business owning class and the professionals and above are concerned. It's like, why do we always have these bad candidates? Why are populists rising? Like, why on one hand can a more moderate establishment candidate barely get anybody show up to their political rallies, whereas people like Donald Trump and AOC fill up 30,000 to 50,000 people arenas and fairgrounds to see them speak? Why is the energy of the culture in economic populism, even though if you look at historically what it's done in places such as Latin America, it's mostly resulted in suboptimal outcomes? There's a few reasons for this. Mainly just because the establishment hasn't dealt with the problem. Like, they are not providing a solution. Why would all the establishment economic policies, what they've done is they have continued the trend of empowering the elites in emerging market countries at the expense of the working classes in developed nations. And people are tired of that. Maybe it makes the world on a global aggregate level a better quality place and reduces global poverty substantially. But just because the poverty rates are lower in Southeast Asia and in Africa and in Latin America, that doesn't make anybody domestically feel that's the root of the problem. Until somebody, whether it's a populist or an establishment class, is able to solve the problem, or at least maybe get lucky and have the economy go back to a growth trajectory, populism is going to continue to rise. The last great era of populism in the Western world was the 1930s. And really what took that to end was World War II and the whole social order having to be reset, and a lot of the imbalances being solved by industrial capacity being taken out by war, and a large chunk of the population dying, reducing overpopulation in many parts of the world. That's what happened. And that is possibly the end game for populism if it keeps going. Either somebody will stumble into a solution that works and creates a new equilibrium, or they'll keep proposing more radical and more authoritarian measures to solve the problem until the system inherently collapses. Whether that's due to external wars, whether that's due to a civil war, whether that's due to hyperinflation, like in the case of Argentina, or some sort of economic depression that rebalances the economy in some way, shape, or form. These imbalances need to be dealt with. And I'm in a future video, I think I'm going to deal with my ideas of some solutions, because the standard populist solutions of protectionism, money printing, wealth redistribution, some form of universal basic income, etc., aren't the answers. And that seems to be the most common answers pitched. And a lot of people ask me about these YouTubers who propose just using prohibitively high income taxes and wealth taxes to simply just legislate away inequality. And that doesn't really solve the problem, because it's not purely an absolute standard of living problem, because absolute standard of livings have been growing in most of this modern populist era. The problem is it's a relative standard of living problem, and it's a perception problem. And I think social media has a role in magnifying this. Like, if you gave everybody a $3,000 a month check tomorrow as some sort of universal basic income, you'd still have people unsatisfied, because they will see somebody who was born into old money on their yacht in Newport Beach or in St. Petersburg, Florida, and they'll be like, why can't I be the person in the yacht? Why is society structured in a way that only those certain people get to have the yacht in the nice city, or get to own the beachfront house, or get to live whatever status symbol or life of that they want? The left kind of caters this to economic issues, and they will probably go into about housing affordability, or in a broader respect that some guy or girl lives a better life than you because they were born into money or have a better education or social connections or whatever it is. Whereas the right goes into social imbalances. They'll say, hey, look, these people get certain privileges because they're not your insert group that's perceived to be aggrieved. I talked about a lot of this in the videos I did about the cynical industrial complex, but that is not going to the solve of the lack of a better term, the spiritual problem, really essentially the economic spiritual problem, in the sense that people don't feel like that their chance of a better future is enough in their control, and that it takes, with a moderate amount of effort, I'll get a moderate improvement in my standard of living. The slope between hard work and success is flattened. And along with that, it has caused a lot of this resentment. And you can't just solve it with random economic growth and a better GDP print. It needs to be the right kind of economic growth that allows more advancement and allows actually better standard of living for the working and the precariat classes. And the thing that's scary is if the professional classes, which are the small business owners, the doctors, the lawyers, the old school version of the middle class, if they start to feel it, then that leads to more political instability and makes populism become even more risky. So really, What's the economics? Why is populism happening? Because the current economic system is not rewarding enough behavior and enough people to advance, and the current politicians are not addressing the problem. Why are the politicians not addressing the problem? Either because it's in their best personal interests not to reward the problem, or they simply just do not know how to fix it, or it's not something that's just inherently structural and cannot be fixed. Like if you have, and due to technological innovation and certain basic factors of supply and demand, which I'm going to get in the solutions video, a lot of these problems cannot be fixed by some random piece of legislation. So it's basically a matter of which populist stumbles upon a solution, or it's going to get more and more radical. So say like what's going on with, bring to modern examples, the tariffs. I'm rooting for the tariff negotiations to result in a more stable international order that eliminates a lot of the populist resentment and creates a healthier foundation for global growth in the future, and one that global growth that re-steepens the hard work to success curve. Because if the president fails to do that, then you're likely to get a more radical form of populism on the other side, probably led by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who will bring a more socialist and UBI-oriented solution to this very problem, which will likely be worse than the previous way of dealing with it, which is the tariffs. And then if that doesn't work, you'll probably have something from the even more populist form of the right, which will be more authoritarian and work probably even more poorly. So that's kind of the danger here. Like the old system was corrupt. The old system was inefficient. The old liberal and national order was really outdated and needed probably reforms since the 2000s. And that's why we've had structurally weak economic growth and minimal standard of living increases since 2001. However, the approach to doing this is where the debate is. And let me know your thoughts. What is the solution to the populist problem? Why do you think populism continues to rise? And can the economic issues driving it be solved through the political process? Or is it going to require more drastic measures? Or can they solve themselves? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this in the comments. Thank you for watching.